Alright, today we're going to look at making an epub, an interactive epub using InDesign. And I'm using InDesign version 5.5. Prior we looked at doing it in Pages. This time we'll look at InDesign, and next time we'll look at using Sigil. Alright, so let's get right to it. This is pretty much as you'd expect with a regular InDesign document. The only difference in here, I did not put any columns in, because columns will not translate well to EPUB, at least through InDesign. You can go and put CSS3 in there and create columns that way. So there was no point in using columns in InDesign because it's not going to translate over. So if we decide to do it, we'll just put it in through CSS3. So it's a singular column on various pages. And as you can see, I have a like introductory section about why interactive EPUBs. I added a page break and I added video. On a separate page, I'm going to put this is where I'm going to put our flex slider gallery, and so I want that on a separate page. Now, a couple things to be said for these. One reason why you might want to use InDesign is the CSS is pretty well formed, pretty well written. People do complain about it being a little heavy. You can always go through and edit out and delete the sections you don't want to minimize your load. But you can do some nice things with it, like a drop cap that is harder to do in, say, Pages. Actually, it's impossible to do in Pages. You then would have to go write CSS to make a drop cap. So if you have something like InDesign, you can do drop caps for it, and you can adjust up and down as you would. You also have your paragraph styles that you can establish. And as you can see, I have various paragraph styles. I have a basic paragraph style and H1, H2. Now, one thing I will say about these, the one thing that is irritating about InDesign coming from a more of a web background is if you want to, like say this, I have it set as an H2, but it's really just a paragraph style. I named it H2 because in my mind that's what it is. But when I render out the CSS, it's actually going to render it as a paragraph with a class of H2. Okay, that's very important to understand. You might want to go back after and get rid of all those sections that have the paragraph H2 and actually make it into a real H2. That way, again, for accessibility and just as an easier way for stacking order and importance hierarchy, it's probably better to actually name it an H2. But for right now, I'm going to use that to set the style. And again, one nice thing about InDesign is you have all your basics in here. As you can see, it's based on a paragraph style. You can set up the size, leading, positioning, font family. You can do a lot of different things all right in InDesign. And the nice thing about it, like I said, it will write the CSS rules for you. Very, very, very handy. The other thing I'll put in here is to know about these pictures. Now, obviously you can drag and drop any pictures in here you want, but there's something that I want you to remember. If you're doing, especially an EPUB, you're probably going to want to anchor down your pictures. And basically what that means is if I were to say I have any of these pictures in here, as you can see this one here, this is not anchored. This one is. As you can see, you got a little anchor symbol up here. Actually, this one is anchored. What will happen is there'll be a little blue square there if it's not anchored. And then you can simply drag it to the area in which you would like it anchored. As you can see, the cursor moving around with the T. That's showing you the anchor point for that image. And the reason why that's important with EPUBs, because obviously you don't want it just flowing everywhere, anywhere. You want it to be anchored to a certain section. And by dropping that anchor point in there, it will stay with this, in this case, this H2 for apps. So even if it's on an iPhone or an iPad, it won't make a difference. It will flow wherever that app is. Soon that that picture will stay with it. Now, the other thing you want to consider, if you look up here, this is where you can control if you have text wrap or you wrap around the box or you don't. Obviously, in this case, I want it to wrap around. And I also want to use these 12 pixels as a little bit of spacing around it. And again, if some of this gets a little distorted or comes out a little bit different than you want, you can always go through and mess with the CSS later and make the appropriate changes. But this will at least give it a good indication about where things are and where they're going to go. And again, that anchor will be very handy to keeping things in line. Now this item I'm using as a pull quote. As you can see, I have it anchored, but it's looking like, oh, it's going to run over and into this pull quote. But it's really not. This is one of the strange things about these text frames when it's anchored. It will look like it's bleeding through it. But when it's rendered out, it will actually curve around it. And again, you see I have it as word wrap around the bounding box here, and it's anchored in. So it will curve around it when it's actually outputted. I want you to remember that so you don't get freaked out about it. I think, of course, you can put your video in. Now, one thing about the video when you're using, say, your media folder for here, it will put it in, but you might cause some problems as far as the way that it codes it, as far as not generating a poster. Even though it says poster from current frame, it will not always work when you're outputting to an epub. So you might want to do a screen capture of that first screen or whatever frame you want to use as your poster, about the same size that you want it, and put it in your images anyways, and you can always go through and fix the HTML. And the last thing, I have a gallery in here. I have one image of what I'm going to use for my flex slider, and I only put one in here just as a placeholder reference, and once we output it, then I'll go through and actually do the HTML changes as necessary to have the slider that I want. But for right now, it's just a placeholder of the size and shape of the future images that I'm going to put in here. Okay? All right, when you're outputting and you're doing your, go to File, go to Export. Now here's my export. If you're going to be selling this, you're going to need a unique identifier. I'm not selling this just for a demonstration, so I don't need one. I also have a first page that I'm going to use as to rasterize to make the first image. Excuse me, make the cover page. That's going to be the first page there. Ordering based on page structure. And again, there's many different ways to do this. You can make it in a book if you want to drag them into that section for your layout and order. But because I'm making it with an epub in mind, I just wanted to do it in the current order. Images. You can change your resolution here, and obviously you can do image size fixed, or you could do relative to page. Alignment and spacing. Again, this can be very handy if you have a larger image, and then when you click on your epub, it will then jump to the right size that you want it, rather than be the size you marked it down to be, which might be only 150 pixels. But when they click on it to see a larger version, you want it to be 500 pixels. That's when you're going to want to change those from fixed to relative to page, depending on what you want. Okay. Contents. From here, you can automatically have it break up the document at the various paragraph styles. And as you can see here, I did it where it looked in my styles and I said, listen, at every H1, that I want to make into a new page. So break it there. And this option is very important. Generate CSS. This will make a separate CSS folder for you with the image, with the styles intact on a separate sheet of paper, rather than embedding it into the document. That's usually the way that most people do their epubs anyways. And I mean, I think by now everybody knows you really should have your presentation layer separate from your structure layer. So with that, we're going to hit OK. All right, and we'll look in a second at making the changes to the CSS and HTML as needed to make this work the way you would like it to, as far as interactive epub, with the flexible slider inside. See you in a second.